Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. And as Kaylee mentioned, it's a beautiful day outside. So if you're sitting inside at the kitchen table listening to this presentation, thank you. I'm glad you're here, and you better enjoy it while you can, because it looks like tomorrow it's going to rain and then it's going to get cold again. So that's the problem with spring, is you get a couple of nice days and think you're done with winter, and then winter reminds you that you're not quite there yet. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Thanks to Kaylee and everybody at Mentor Public Library for continuing to support these programs, and especially the last year or so, as they've been a little challenging with the COVID situation, but we've, I think, gotten into a sort of a good rhythm here with doing these virtually. So we'll continue to do it this way until it's safe to start doing it in person again. But I'm glad that we get a chance to connect with everybody once a month to talk about leaders and legacies of the Civil War era. Many of you probably know that originally, under the original Constitution, the inauguration of the president was always set for March 4th. That was the original inauguration day. It didn't change to January 20th until the second inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s. So all the presidents up to Roosevelt, for the most part, were inaugurated on March 4th. So that means that we're now at the 160th anniversary this month of Lincoln's first inauguration. And of course, it also means we're at the 140th anniversary this month of James Garfield's inauguration. But because this is a series about leaders and legacies of the Civil War, it seemed like a good time to talk a little bit about Lincoln's first inaugural address, given, of course, March 4th, 1861, when the Civil War had obviously not quite started yet, although the groundwork had certainly been laid at that point. So what I'm going to do is just, show you some slides, as we always do, talk a little bit about kind of what led up to Lincoln's election and inauguration, and then I will actually have some passages from the inaugural address that he delivered on March 4th, 1861, and really just kind of try to talk a little bit about what he was saying and what he meant and what the situation was at that time. So we will go through the slides like we always do, and then at the end, if you have questions, be they through the microphone or just put into the chat, and then Kaylee can let me know what they are. I'm happy to try to answer any questions you may have at the end. So here we go. So of course, we can't really talk much about Lincoln's inauguration until we talk about the election of 1860 and how did he come to be elected president. As you can see on the screen there, it was kind of a four-way race for president in 1860. We don't see this too often anymore. Yeah, you get your occasional third-party candidate, a Ross Perot or a Ralph Nader or something like that, but it's usually just the two major party candidates. In the case of 1860, it was interesting. Lincoln, of course, was the Republican candidate. The Democratic Party actually split into two factions: the Northern Democrats, who were represented by Stephen Douglas, who, like Lincoln, was from Illinois, and is the guy that Lincoln had actually run against for the Senate in 1858 and famously debated in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That's Douglas from the Lincoln-Douglas debates right there. So Douglas was the Northern Democratic candidate. His main take on the issue of slavery was favoring popular sovereignty, letting people in the territories decide whether or not they would be slave or free. And then John C. Breckinridge at the far side there was the Southern Democratic candidate, who had been vice president of the United States for the previous 4 years under James Buchanan. And he was, as a Southern Democrat from Kentucky, his platform as the Southern Democratic candidate was simply that the federal government must protect property rights. And by property rights, he, of course, meant slavery. And then the third, or rather the fourth candidate was John C. Bell. And he was running under the Constitutional Union Party, which is, again, kind of a third party that didn't generate a ton of support. And basically, the Constitutional Union Party said that the situation should just remain as is, status quo. And then finally, Lincoln, of course, who was running on the Republican platform. A lot of people assume that Lincoln was an abolitionist at this point. He really was not. The Republican Party at this time simply said that slavery must not expand into the territories. It did not say slavery must be abolished. And we'll we'll see more of that when we get to actually looking at some of the passages from Lincoln's address. But neither he nor the Republican Party at this time were calling for slavery to be abolished. Yes, there were abolitionists in the Republican Party, but the Republican Party itself as a platform on which Lincoln was running was not calling for the abolition of slavery. So here's just a map showing you how the 1860 election played out. The red states are the ones that Lincoln won as the Republican candidate. The green ones are the ones that Breckinridge won as the Southern Democratic candidate. Douglas didn't do a whole heck of a lot as the Northern Democratic candidate, winning Missouri and New Jersey. And then finally, the orange is John C. Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, who basically, again, sort of felt like the status quo should prevail and things should just be left as they were. So Lincoln wins the election because, of course, every Republican votes for Lincoln, but Democrats are split. So, once you split a party like that, it's very, very hard for that party to come out on top of an election because they're, half the Democrats are voting for Douglas, half of them are voting for Breckinridge, and then throw another party, a third party or fourth party in this case into the mix, and it's that much more difficult for anyone but Lincoln to win. So even though Lincoln wins only about 40% of the popular vote, he clearly wins the Electoral College. And of course, even recent history has reminded us that the Electoral College is really what counts when you're trying to be elected president. So it is possible to lose the popular vote and still win the Electoral College and therefore become president. And that has happened several times in our history. So once Lincoln is announced as the winner of this election, the Republican candidate, a number of southern states, primarily South Carolina, especially South Carolina, begin to agitate to just secede from the Union and no longer be part of the United States. They view Lincoln as they view every Republican as an abolitionist, and they call Republicans, including Lincoln, damned black Republicans, meaning that they're in favor of abolishing slavery, which again, they weren't for the most part. Southerners believed that, or chose to believe that, I guess you should say. Lincoln himself said many times he didn't feel that slavery could be abolished. He didn't constitutionally have that ability, but just felt like slavery should not be allowed to expand into new territories. And so on December 20th of 1860, South Carolina becomes the first state to declare itself seceded from the United States. And you could have kind of a fun semantic argument there about, did Southern states actually secede, or did they merely try to secede or call themselves seceded? And you could come down maybe on a couple of different sides of that. But either way, I had a high school history teacher who said that every problem that this country ever had started in South Carolina. And obviously he was trying to be funny and being facetious, but in this case, yes, in fact, this secession movement did actually start in South Carolina when South Carolina became the first state to secede just before Christmas of 1860. By the time Lincoln starts actually leaving his home in Illinois to journey to Washington, D.C., 7 states total had declared themselves seceded: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. So primarily deep South states. Further northern southern states, for example, Virginia, North Carolina, had not yet seceded at this point. We're talking about February here, mid-February of 1861, when Lincoln is preparing to leave his home in Illinois to journey to Washington to become president, because again, the inauguration didn't take place until March 4th, not January 20th like it does today. On February 11th, 1861, Lincoln left his home in Springfield, Illinois, which, by the way, if you go there now, his home is now Lincoln Home National Historic Site, run by us, the National Park Service. He gave this very heartfelt farewell address to the citizens of Springfield before he left. And he talked about how long he'd lived in Springfield and the fact that one of his sons was buried there who had died. And he even says, I have a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. And of course, he's referring to this idea of trying to keep the country from ripping itself apart, which many Southern states had already begun to do by declaring themselves seceded from the country. Once Lincoln left Springfield on February 11th, 1861, he never returned to Springfield alive, because of course he never made it back there during the Civil War. And then of course we all know what happens to Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. Tragically, this is the same thing that happens to James Garfield. In fact, when he leaves his home right here where I'm sitting in Mentor, Ohio, to go to the White House, like Lincoln, he's assassinated, and like Lincoln, he never saw his home again either. This is a map showing you the route that Lincoln took from Springfield. And if you look on the left of your screen there, you'll see February 11th, you'll see Springfield. And then you see kind of this somewhat circuitous route he took to Washington, D.C. That took about 12 days or so to get to Washington. You'll notice he did make some stops in Ohio, stopped in Cincinnati and Columbus and Cleveland. And then 4 years later, after Lincoln was killed, the funeral train that returned his remains to Springfield to be buried went on this pretty much this same route to get Lincoln's body from Washington back to Springfield to be buried. So Lincoln's body did pass through Cleveland and other parts of Ohio 4 years later, after he was assassinated. During his trip to Washington in 1861, he did stop in Columbus, and he did briefly address the Ohio State legislature there. And then you see a quote from a young state senator here on the screen in Ohio. In some respects, I was disappointed in Lincoln, but in most he surpasses expectation. Through all his awkward homeliness, and of course, Lincoln is famously, somewhat homely looking, not the most attractive guy by many descriptions. There is a look of transparent, genuine goodness, which at once reaches your heart and makes you trust and love him. He has the tone and bearing of a fearless, firm man, and I have great hope for the government. And of course, that young state senator who wrote those words was James Garfield. James Garfield, of course, in the Ohio State Senate up until the time he left. He left to go join the Union Army. And it's not really the subject of our presentation today, but it is worth noting that Garfield rather did have some frustrations with Lincoln as Lincoln was president and was running the Civil War. Garfield had some frustrations with Lincoln because he didn't think Lincoln acted quickly enough to make the war about abolishing slavery. So Garfield did end up, even though he says here in 1861, early 1861, I have great hope for the government, he did later express some frustrations with Lincoln when Lincoln was president. As Lincoln is making his way to Washington, there's some word that of a plot to assassinate him before he even makes it to Washington, so he can't actually take office. And so his security detail convinces him to kind of sneak into Washington late at night when nobody's paying attention. And so that's what happened. Lincoln didn't have this sort of triumphant ride into Washington where he was coming to become inaugurated as president. He sort of slid in the middle of the night under cover of darkness, and he later was pretty angry about this. He felt like all of this word about the plot to assassinate him was kind of overblown, and he thought that coming in the middle of the night in the dark kind of made him look weak, and he needed at this point to project strength as he's coming in to take over as president and really try to keep the country together or bring the country back together. And so he was very unhappy with how this went down, but he did arrive in Washington late at night on February 23rd, and then of course prepared to take office on March 4th. So now I'm going to just sort of share some passages from the inaugural address and try to give you a little bit of idea of kind of what he was actually talking about. So here Lincoln is basically kind of talking about how the southern states feel about him becoming president. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property, meaning slavery, of course, Their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. So here's Lincoln saying, you're creating all of this in your own minds, but there's really nothing solid to back that up. You don't need to have any apprehension about what a Republican administration means for you. And then he says there at the bottom, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. So here he is as president now saying that, this is not what you think I'm going to do, I'm not going to do. And so now he is kind of directly speaking to Southerners. Now, in a lot of cases, it's too late for a lot of them because they've already seceded. But at any rate, he's trying to reassure people that this administration will not attack slavery where it already exists. It means only to keep slavery out of the new territories. Here he addresses a little bit about the fugitive slave law, which is very controversial even at this time. There had been a fugitive slave law for really since the Constitution had been in place, and then it really wasn't enforced very strongly. And then as part of the Compromise of 1850, which did a number of things, the South insisted on a new, much more stringently enforced fugitive slave law, which basically said that Southerners who are in search of escaped slaves, escaped enslaved people, can go into northern states, can go into other areas, and can try to find those people and to recapture them and take them back into slavery in the South. And it also gave those Southerners pretty wide latitude to kind of force Northerners to help them search for escaped slaves. And so it was very controversial, and abolitionists absolutely despised the fugitive slave law. And but anyway, Lincoln here is sort of basically saying it's the law of the land. Even if we don't like it, we have to enforce it. There's much controversy about the delivering up of fugitives from service or labor. The clause I now read is as plainly written in the Constitution as any other of its provisions. And here he quotes the law: no person held to service or labor in one state under laws thereof, or escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So again, giving Southerners the right to go into northern areas and recapture slaves and take them back into the South, into slavery. And again, here he's acknowledging that even though people don't like it necessarily, it is the law of the land. All members of Congress swear their support to the whole Constitution, to this provision as much to any other. So you can't sort of cherry pick which pieces of the Constitution you'll follow and which ones you won't. Which you can't decide, you can't choose to follow some laws but ignore others. Again, talking here about Constitution, I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. Continue to execute all the express provisions of our national Constitution, and the Union will endure forever, it being impossible to destroy it except by some action not provided for in the instrument itself. Again, if the United States be not a government proper, but an association of states in the nature of contract merely, can it, as a contract, be peaceably unmade by less than all the parties who made it? One party to a contract may violate it, break it, so to speak, but does it not require all to lawfully rescind it? So he's basically saying here, the association of states as the United States is perpetual. The Constitution does not provide for the manner of its own destruction by allowing states to say, we don't want to be states anymore. So he's basically, and when it's a common sense argument, it seems, but He's basically laying the groundwork here to say that it's really not appropriate or not lawful for states to declare themselves no longer states, no longer part of the United States. More here about the Constitution. The proposition that in legal contemplation, the Union is perpetual, confirmed by the history of the Union itself. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed, in fact, by the Articles of Association in 1774. It was matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And it was further matured in the faith of all the then 13 states expressly plighted and engaged that it should be perpetual by the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation being the form of government that the United States had before the Constitution. And in fact, if you recall your American history classes, the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787 to originally not to write a new constitution, but in fact to amend and strengthen the Articles of Confederation. It was only once everybody got in the room, and this includes, luminaries like George Washington and James Madison and people like that, and John Adams, they looked at the Articles of Confederation and eventually decided that they would be better off completely scrapping that form of government and creating something new and better and stronger than they would be amending the Articles of Confederation. But it's interesting here too that Lincoln mentions the Declaration of Independence, because it's really the Declaration of Independence that Lincoln later uses to justify making the war about not only saving the Union, which he's already laying the groundwork for here in this address, but also about abolishing slavery. Now, keep in mind, at this point, he doesn't believe he has the authority to do anything about slavery. That authority comes, of course, when the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter and begins the Civil War. So everything changes then, and Lincoln does feel he then has that authority, but this is all in the future, far beyond what we're talking about today. But anyway, it's great that he mentions the Declaration of Independence here, because it was the Declaration of Independence that he really drew on when he was writing some of his greatest speeches, like the Gettysburg Address, and where he's basically acknowledging that, if we say that we are a country that is based on the proposition that all men are created equal, then we need to live up to that. And we need this war to be a new birth of freedom for everyone. And so Lincoln draws a lot more inspiration, I think, from the Declaration of Independence than he ever does from the Constitution. But of course, he's referring to the Constitution here primarily in this address, simply because he's stating his view that the Constitution does not provide for states withdrawing from the Union and seceding. So again, going on along those same lines, I therefore consider that in view of the Constitution and the laws of the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. So in his mind, even states that have declared themselves seceded and are now going down the road of creating their own country that becomes the Confederate States of America, in Lincoln's mind, those states are still states. And he still has not only the authority, but also the obligation to enforce the laws in all of those states, even if they have declared themselves to no longer, in their minds, be part of the United States of America. I trust this will not be regarded as a menace, but only as the declared purpose of the Union, that it will constitutionally defend and maintain itself. Again, the Constitution does not provide for the means of its own destruction, and therefore it can't destroy itself. Therefore, it has to be defended and has to be maintained. And even when states declare themselves no longer states, the United States still has authority there. So now he's starting to really say this can be done without war. In doing this, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence. There shall be none unless it be forced upon the national authority. So he's telling the South, we're not going to attack you, but if you attack us, then there will be bloodshed and violence. The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. Remember, he's specifically addressing places like Fort Sumter right here that are already under siege, I guess you would say, almost, by Southerners. Fort Sumter, of course, in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, the state that first declared itself seceded. So he's letting the South know he will protect, he will defend those places because they are the property of the federal government. And even though they happen to be located in a state that declares itself no longer part of the Union, he doesn't see it that way, and he's going to protect and defend those places. But if you Southerners let me do this peacefully, there will be no blood. There needs to be no bloodshed or violence here. Continuing to draw on the Constitution here, all profess to be content in the Union if all constitutional rights can be maintained. Is it true then that any right plainly written in the Constitution has been denied? I think not. So he's saying, no constitutional rights of Southerners have been violated here. Southerners obviously don't feel that the federal government has done enough to protect slavery. So they feel that their constitutional rights have been denied. Lincoln is saying that's not the case. Think if you can, to Southerners, think if you can of a single instance in which a plainly written provision of the Constitution has ever been denied. If by the mere force of numbers a majority should deprive a minority of any clearly written constitutional right, it might in a moral point of view justify revolution. Certainly would if such right were a vital one, but such is not our case. So again, he's really he's hammering away what the Constitution says, what it means, and what his interpretation of what is allowed under the Constitution. Shall fugitives from labor be surrendered by national or by state authority? The Constitution does not expressly say. May Congress prohibit slavery in the territories? The Constitution does not expressly say. Must Congress protect slavery in the territories? The Constitution does not expressly say. So he's also acknowledging here that the Constitution is open to interpretation. And I think most of us would agree with that assessment today. The Constitution is open, it is a living document, it is open to interpretation, and most importantly, it can be changed. That's why we have the amendment process. And that's also why later, several years later here, Lincoln is adamant that the 13th Amendment must be passed so that we can make it the law of the land that slavery is no longer permitted in the United States. Continuing to address secession here, plainly the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or to despotism. Unanimity is impossible. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form is all that is left. We are a country that believes in majority rule. And the Southerners who are wanting to break away from the country and secede and form their own country in order to protect slavery and expand slavery are a minority. And yet they're calling all the shots here. And Lincoln is saying that cannot be allowed. That is not the way it works in the United States of America. One section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. Notice he doesn't say believes it is wrong and ought to be abolished. He only says it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. The fugitive slave clause of the Constitution and the law for the suppression of the foreign slave trade are each as well enforced, perhaps, as any law can ever be in a community where the moral sense of the people imperfectly supports the law itself. The great body of the people abide by the dry legal obligation in both cases, and a few break over in each. This, I think, cannot be perfectly cured, and it would be worse in both cases after the separation of the sections than before. So again, not everybody likes every provision of the Constitution or every law on the books, or specifically the fugitive slave law, and yet all acknowledge that it is the law of the land and must be acknowledged. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. That's fairly obvious. You can't, South Carolina can't pick up and move itself, further south or anything like that. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. And of course, some of you may remember the Berlin Wall, which did try to do that, tried to divide the city of Berlin in half during the Cold War. And yeah, it stood for a while, but really ultimately less than 30 years because it just became obvious that it wasn't realistic to maintain. A husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other, but the different parts of our country cannot do this. They cannot but remain face to face, and intercourse, either amicable or hostile, must continue between them. Is it possible then to make that intercourse more advantageous or more satisfactory after separation than before? In other words, can secession improve things? Certainly not. Can aliens make treaties easier than friends can make laws? Can treaties be more faithfully enforced between aliens than laws can among friends? Suppose you go to war, you cannot fight always. And when, after much loss on both sides and no gain on either, you cease fighting, the identical old questions as to terms of intercourse are again upon you. So again, he's saying that the country is stronger and better staying together than it is separating. We can't physically separate. We can't not deal with each other. Wouldn't it be better to deal with each other as equals, all with the status of states, than as states that are trying to separate from one another? War and separation are not going to make things better. This is a very long one. I obviously won't read this whole thing, but this country with its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it, or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. I cannot be ignorant of the fact that many worthy and patriotic citizens are desirous of having the national constitution amended. While I make no recommendation of amendments, I fully recognize the rightful authority of the people over the whole subject. So again, he's acknowledging that not everybody is always going to be happy with the direction the government is going all the time. But he's also acknowledging that, yes, in fact, the Constitution is a living document. It is able to be changed because of the amendment process. And so if people have a grievance with the government, they have every right to make that known. And they have every right to seek redress from the government for that. But what they don't have the right to do in Lincoln's interpretation is to try to separate the country, and that the Constitution does not allow for the country to tear itself apart. Does not carry the seeds of its own destruction, as he says earlier in the address. And then this is probably the most famous passage of Lincoln's first inaugural, where he again directly addresses the South. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government. while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. So he's saying, again, the federal government will not attack the South. You can have no conflict, Southerners, unless you start it, because we are not going to attack you over this. We will work for a peaceful resolution to this crisis. You have not taken an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, but I, as the new president of the United States, have done that. And therefore, it is my obligation to do it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and every patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. So he's saying, you know, we must remain countrymen. We must not be enemies. We must not fight one another. We must find ways to work through our differences. We must find ways to keep the country together. We must not be enemies. We must be friends. We must work together. We must all be Americans. And this photo is a photo of Lincoln's first inauguration. And if you can kind of see at the top there to the right a little bit, there's some, construction going on there. So for much of the Civil War, the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol wasn't even finished. It was actually being built during the Civil War. So if you see photos of wartime Washington, D.C., you'll see that the rotunda was not even finished at that point. So anyway, this is the conclusion of Lincoln's first inaugural address. And he's saying, if we all just step back and take a breath and try to work on this, we will remain friends, we will remain countrymen, and we don't have to fight each other over these issues. And of course, you all know what happens. On April 12th, 1861, just about 5 weeks after Lincoln gives this speech, Confederates do in fact fire on Fort Sumter. And naturally, this changes everything. Now, the country does, in fact, go to war with itself. Now, the things that Lincoln says, he doesn't think he can do, suddenly the situation changes dramatically, and he is able to do some of the things because now he's fighting a war, what he considers to be an insurrection, a rebellion against the federal government. So now he can do things that without this he could not do. So he implores the South in this address to not go to war over these issues, but the South eventually does decide that it's worth fighting over. And then, of course, if you fast forward 4 years and you read the address that he gives at his second inaugural, it is much different, obviously, because the country at that point has now gone through 4 years of war and over 700,000 Americans killed. But in the second inaugural, which maybe I'll do a talk about sometime, he does kind of look to the future and start thinking about and talking about what is the country going to look like now going forward, now that we've had this war, now that we are prepared to abolish slavery and we are prepared to completely remake what the country looks like. We are now prepared to take advantage of this new birth of freedom that he called for in the Gettysburg Address, and that by the time of his second inaugural in March of 1865 is starting to become a reality. And at that point, the war is going to be over in a few months anyway. Obviously, we know Lincoln doesn't survive, and who knows how different American history might look if he had. So that is a very quick 42 or so minute look, it looks like, at Lincoln's first inaugural. Again, it's both of Lincoln's inaugural addresses are masterpieces. The second inaugural is widely considered, which is not this one, obviously, is considered one of his probably 3 or 4 greatest speeches, right up there with the Gettysburg Address and some of the others. But because we're at the 160th anniversary of the beginning of the war, the beginning of Lincoln's administration, it seemed like the more natural choice to talk about this one today. So maybe another time we'll do a presentation on Lincoln's second inaugural as well. So at this point, if you have questions, Kaylee, I don't know if you open people's mics or you read them off or whatever we normally do.
I didn't have any questions in the chat today, but I did unmute, so allow participants to unmute. So if anyone has any questions, you should be able to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
I have a question.
Sure.
What did Lincoln do between February 23rd and his inauguration on March 4th? That's quite a while.
Yeah, that is. That's maybe not quite 2 weeks, I guess. He was staying in a hotel. He was taking meetings. He was working on the inaugural address. He did not have the inaugural completely finished when he left Illinois, so he was working on that. He was meeting with people who would be, he wanted to be in his cabinet. So he was basically preparing to govern, just trying to get ready for March 4th. We see that to a degree with James Garfield too, in that when he gets to Washington around February 28th, I believe, when he's getting ready to be inaugurated on March 4th, and he's spending time with his family. He's taking all kinds of meetings. He completely rewrites his inaugural address just less than 48 hours before the inauguration. So this was not uncommon for presidents at this time to get to Washington quite early, and then start meeting with people that were going to be important to them, whether it be cabinet members, members of Congress, whatever the case may be. So yeah, Lincoln was I believe was staying at the Willard Hotel, I think, don't quote me on that, and just taking meetings and working on his inaugural address and getting ready to govern and become president.
There was another question here. Why did the inauguration date change from March to January?
That's a good question. That was part of I believe part of a constitutional amendment that called for that change. And I think that really was just the feeling that lame duck period was just too long. And really, one of the best examples of that is 1860-61, where Lincoln is elected at the beginning of November, and then basically has to sit there on his hands for 4 months and watch the country fall apart. And watch his predecessor, James Buchanan, basically sit there and go, I don't really know what to do. And basically say, I don't know that I can do much because I'm not going to be president much longer. And so I think there was a feeling that the lame duck period was just too long. The same thing happened when you think about when that change was made. Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated for the first time in 1933 on March 4th. But his second term he was inaugurated. That change took place during his first term. So he was inaugurated for the second time on January 20th. But when he was first elected, FDR in 1932, same thing. He's got 4 months to sit there and not be able to do very much and watch the Great Depression just get worse and worse and worse. And so I think that there just was a feeling that lame duck period was just way too long, and it needed to be a shorter period. Why January the 20th specifically, not January 10th, not January 15th, not January 12th? Why they specifically chose the 20th, I can't answer that, but I know they moved it up really just because that lame duck period was far too long.
The next question here is, did Lincoln write his own address, or did they have speech writers like they do today?
Good question. And the answer is Lincoln did write his own address. Speech writers were not commonly used at this point. Yes, you might have people giving advice on speeches and things like that, but people like Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, they did primarily write most of their own speeches. It was not until further down the road that presidents really began to employ speech writers to basically craft speeches for them, and then they would make comments and make notes and ask the speech writers to go back and change some things. So yeah, that wasn't, I don't know exactly when that came in, but it definitely was not commonly done at this point. So yes, Lincoln did write that inaugural himself, as well as the second inaugural, and certainly even up to the time of James Garfield, he wrote his inaugural as well. And we know that with Garfield simply because we know he scrapped his entire address and started all over again with 48 hours to go until the inauguration. So so yeah, when they started using speechwriters, I'm not sure, but it was not commonly done at this point.
Okay, so there's a comment here. If you look at the voting pie chart from the election, Lincoln was quite lucky that the Democrats split, as they may have actually had a total of 47%. Lincoln may have lost it if the Dems did not split.
Yeah, he was definitely
I
mean, from the popular vote perspective, he was absolutely a minority president. There's no question. Now, how would it have gone if the Democrats hadn't split? Would Breckinridge have been able to gather enough votes in the North to beat Lincoln? I don't know. Would Stephen Douglas have been able to gather enough votes from anywhere? I mean, as you can see, he didn't do so great. He won only Missouri and looks like part of New Jersey. But there's no question, yes, that Lincoln was in fact a minority president because of that split. So yes, absolutely. The vote in the Electoral College is significant. You can see he wins 59% of the electoral vote. But yes, in the popular vote side, he's absolutely a minority president, no question.
There's a question, why did Lincoln pretty much bypass Pennsylvania except Pittsburgh while going to Washington?
I can't answer that specifically other than to say maybe he viewed it as more important to get up into New York. But yeah, you're right. And yeah, I can't answer that. That's a great question. Unless, again, maybe he wanted to make that swing through New York. But yeah, I don't know why.
Well, it looks like he also went to Philadelphia and Harrisburg, so it might just be the cities themselves.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, he didn't go straight across. He didn't go straight across PA. He kind of went above it and then circled back to it. You're right. So yeah, I think it just was a question of trying to get through New York and then maybe hitting Pennsylvania on the way down, because Pennsylvania is, you can see is really the southern PA is not that far from Washington. So I think maybe it was a conscious choice to do Pennsylvania kind of last, because then just dropping down to places like Baltimore and Washington was much easier. And that still allowed him to get through New York, which is a very large, very important, very populous state. So it gives him the chance to get up there and be seen in New York.
Next question here. Was there anything to the plot to kidnap Lincoln on his way to Washington, or was it more rumors?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there was, I don't know a ton about that. Lincoln himself later came to believe that it was very overblown, that, and he did specifically state later that he, in looking back on it, felt like if he had gone, if they hadn't paid any attention to that, no harm would have come to him. That was his interpretation. The security people around him, and again, this is, Pinkerton agents and things like this. This is not the Secret Service like we think of today, who are responsible for presidential security. They seem to think that there was something to it, specifically in Baltimore. And keep in mind, Maryland is a southern state at the, considered a southern state here. It later, once the war begins, it becomes one of those border states. So it's a state that has slavery within its boundaries, but never secedes and joins the Confederacy. But there is some very, very strong pro-Confederate sympathy in Maryland, and especially in the city of Baltimore. And so I think that the security detail was right to be worried, and they played it safe. And so I think ultimately that was probably a good decision. You can certainly understand Lincoln's perspective in that, he thinks, sort of sneaking into Washington in the middle of the night makes him look weak. Yeah, okay, I can see what he's saying there. There were all these rumors that he hid in a dress, and all this. None of that stuff is true. He didn't sneak into the city wearing a dress or anything like that. But he was brought in the middle of the night really just to guarantee his safety. I think that probably was a wise choice. Better to err on the side of caution there. And keep in mind, if anything had happened to Lincoln at this point, Hannibal Hamlin would have become president, not Andrew Johnson. Hannibal Hamlin from Maine was the first vice president under Lincoln. And then they rather unceremoniously dump him in 1864 to put Andrew Johnson on the ticket. Imagine how different American history might have turned out had Hamlin become president in 1865 when Lincoln was killed instead of Johnson. So, Hamlin was certainly far superior to Andrew Johnson. So I think, history may have turned out very differently, but it's all speculation now.
All right. Well, we'll see you next month, and hopefully all of you will join us again. And thank you so much for your time today. And hopefully everyone gets outside to enjoy this nice day before we get into back to the regular Ohio weather.